Gracias.
Thank you, Belén. Thank you, Juan Maria Laboa and Simona Negruzzo, for these wonderful presentations. We're going to start the second roundtable. Once we've done a little bit and reviewed the historical path, we're going to come to current times and the division of powers between the EU and member states and how it affects citizen participation. We're going to have two speeches, one by Leopoldo Calvo-Sotelo, and I'll ask them to come onto the stage. And we're going to have comments by Markus Schlagnitweit. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name properly. And then Carlo Muzzi. And we're going to have Michele Bonetti as moderator. So thank you very much for coming on stage, and let's get started. Good morning. Thank you very much, Paul VI Foundation, for having organized, together with the Paul VI Institute, this important event within the program of the permanent seminar in matters of how Europe responds to modern challenges. I'm happy to moderate this roundtable on the mapping of skills between the Union and member states and how it affects citizen participation. I do so happily, both personally and institutionally. Personally, it reminds me of the research that I did on European standard and the impact on legislation, particularly the Italian legislation. In this roundtable, we're going to be talking about the allocation of competences within the Union according to the mandates of the Treaty of Lisbon, according to which the Union has powers and can act only within the limits set up by state members in order to achieve the objectives of the treaty. That is not allocated to the Union is a prerogative of member states. We need to underline that the competences that are organized in the three main categories see their exercise subject to two main principles: the principle of proportionality and subsidiarity. These are principles that take actions as close to citizens as possible in order to be as efficient as possible, as expressed by the European Commission in 2017, when they created a task force for subsidiarity and proportionality in order to create better laws. Institutionally, this gives me the opportunity to underline the sense of asking the Sergio Tovini organization to participate, and I'm the president of such organization, because it is an organization that is coherent with the spirit and the topic of our event today. When it comes to the spirit of our event today, we need to remember the framework in which we are included. We're talking about Paul VI. Tovini was the speaker, the main speaker of the spiritual cultural world of that Brescia that gave place to the birth of Pope Montini. He had humble origins. He then became a lawyer. He founded banks, newspapers, magazines, aid organizations to help the society, and he did it in order to respond to the sense of emergency that he perceived. That means the emergency to keep faith and Christian education among the youth. In 1998, John Paul II, in Brescia, during the beatification of Tovini, it's important to say that between Tovini and Montini there was a very deep spiritual and value link. In 1957, the substitute to the Secretariat of State, Monsignor Montino, he was Monsignor back then, said about Tovini, and I quote, "His life was a constant war and a constant prayer. There is no bigger praise for his work than this." Tovini then inspired this dimension that was created from contemplation and that served as inspiration for the Pope from Brescia. And the Tovini institution wants to keep the spirit of the pedagogical intent within higher education. And that's why we create training programs, cooperation programs, and volunteering programs. When it comes to the topic that we're going to cover nowadays, we need to point out its methodology. The idea that it inspires is the relationship between institutions, its participants, and the role of citizens. And we're talking about a central reality, a peripheral reality, and its protagonists. It's important here to underline the ethical roots that underline this relationship and therefore the subsidiarity principle that we have mentioned before, so that each sector is subject to the action of the Union as long as such action cannot be satisfied by member states. And now we have the principle of proportionality, according to which the means of the Union need to be appropriate in order to achieve the desired outcome. Pope Paul VI, in 1969, while he was speaking about the exercise of freedom in social terms, wanted to point out the subsidiarity principle that was fed into the Lisbon Treaty, because he said, and I quote, "In a well-organized society, this principle aims to provide the biggest possible freedom to citizens and to make it compulsory only that is essential for an important objective that serves the common good." Therefore, Papa Montini said words that are coherent with the society in which he lived. Social Catholicism that was developed in the 800s and 900s in the Western world, in Europe, and particularly in Italy, and there were difficult times in Italy because Catholics could not take part in political life, promoted economic educational work. It was an effort that was developed not against the state or by replacing the state, but together with the state. An example, even in Brescia, we can find many examples there. Tovini said that being Catholic never prevented me from loving my country land. So the public level is compatible with the private level. And that's why they can express their self-determination with a bottom-up approach. And this is how in Europe we had intellectual circles, schools, charity organizations as an expression of the awareness of individuals and institutions that can cohabitate and cooperate within states for a common good. And this should be a more general rule. And this, talking about the proportionality principle, I believe it's important to point out the themes that we're going to cover nowadays. And we're going to have three important speakers. It was the Secretary General of the Institute Juan March of Research. He was Subsecretary of the Administrative Board of Vodafone Spain, Professor of the Legal Area and Director of the International Relations and Masters of the Instituto de Empresa, and Professor nowadays at the CEU São Paulo University, and he's a collaborator of ABC. We will have comments by two notable speakers. The first one is Markus Schlagnitweit. He's the director of the Catholic Academy of Austria. He studied at Innsbruck and Rome. He specialized in the social doctrine of the Church. And last but not least, we'll have Carlo Muzzi, who's the responsible of internal and foreign affairs at Giornale di Brescia. He graduated and had a degree in international relations at the University of Brescia. And he writes about politics and European issues. He studies populist parties and their history, and he even wrote a book called Eurosceptics, What Do These Movements Want? And that was published in 2019, and he's still writing a second book devoted to the history of European populist parties that I'm sure will be published soon. Thank you. Professor Leopoldo Calvo-Sotelo, you have the floor. Thank you very much, the Paul VI Foundation and its director, for inviting me for such an important and interesting program as the one we're covering today. My speech will have a legal approach that corresponds to my training, and I think that this speech will be complemented by political and journalist expertise of the other speakers present at this table. I would like to do an introduction about the dual citizenship of the Union. I believe that the treaty says that the citizenship of the Union is added to national citizenship without substituting it. That means that the citizenship of the European Union is a complement of the one of the member states. That means that the citizens of EU member states have two different status, the European one and the national one, and both are exercised in a compatible and cumulative way. Which are the rights that are proper to the European citizenship? First of all, we have the right to vote and to stand as a candidate in elections to the European Parliament, something we'll do pretty much soon. Then they have the right to petition the European Parliament. And then, in third place, and it's particularly important, we have the right to promote the initiative to invite the European Commission to submit an appropriate proposal on matters where the citizen promoters consider that a legal act of the Union is required. No doubt it would be natural for European rights of civic participation to be exercised on matters falling within the competence of the European Union. And this way, we would invoke the slogan of our session. But this is not always the case. Just as important as the question of competence in the matters in which citizens' rights are exercised is the question of whether a right of civic participation is exercised with a view to the European political space, that would be natural, or to the national political space, as is most often the case. And we will come back to this point later. Now we're going to refer to the current affairs when it comes to citizen participation in the European Union. There are several documents that I'm going to quickly list and that are important. First of all, we have a resolution of the European Parliament of 2019 on the application of treaty provisions relating to citizenship of the Union. This resolution recalls the need to promote the European dimension of the European parliamentary elections and stresses the need to inform citizens of the recent reform of the electoral law and the process of designating the heads of lists, the famous Spitzenkandidaten, insisting on the political importance and symbolism of this figure in order to strengthen citizenship of the Union. On the other hand, we have a final report of the Conference on the Future of Europe of May 2022, which in its proposal regarding democracy and elections contains elements whose adoption would also require the reform of the treaties, since its very ambition. And, for example, it calls for the introduction of a referendum at the European Union that would be called by the European Parliament on matters of particular importance for all EU citizens, or even the possible election of the Commission President by universal suffrage of the citizens of the Union. More recently, we had the legislative resolution of the European Parliament of May 2022 on the proposal for a Council regulation concerning the election of the members of the European Parliament by direct universal suffrage. There are two recitals of this resolution that are particularly eloquent. One of them says, and I quote, "Whereas European political parties contribute to forming European political awareness and should therefore play a more prominent role in European Parliament election campaigns, so as to enhance their visibility and make clear the link between the vote for a particular national party and its impact on the size of the European political group in the European Parliament and on the appointment of the President of the Commission." Secondly, we're talking about the establishment of a union-wide constituency for all the union constituencies, whose list would be headed by the candidate of each political family for President of the Commission, and that will strengthen European democracy and contribute to the creation of a European political space that would rival with the national political spaces that have an almost monopoly of citizen attention. Within this sole constituency, we would choose 28 members of the European Parliament without affecting the number of representatives elected by each member state. Therefore, this proposal is compatible with treaties. We don't need to amend the treaties. And last but not least, we're going to cover the different types of exercise of citizen participation rights, because we said whether we exercise one right, whether we have our view on the European political space or on the national space, well, on that depends whether we have one objective or another in terms of the content of the exercise of such rights. What could happen is the other situation, that is, for a national citizen right to be exercised only with the view of the European Union. I'm going to provide an example that is rare but possible. Let's ask for example, the petition right considered by Article 29 of the Spanish Constitution. This right could be exercised by a citizen, a group of citizens, in order to address the Spanish Parliament at the Cortes Generales to ensure respect for the principle of subsidiarity in accordance with the protocol on the application of the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality. We're not going to talk about the principle of subsidiarity that was already explained by our moderator, but this subsidiarity principle is considered by national parliaments, but a citizen might petition their parliament to stop a certain law because it would be better resolved at national level. And this, as I said, is possible, but is not very likely to happen. What is actually likely, and it's something that we are witnessing every single day, is exactly the opposite situation. That is, for European rights having been conceived for its exercise within the European political space are exercised only taking into account the national nature of its impact. A very famous example is the example of Brexit. Brexit was born because of the exercise of European political rights that they used for national effects so that they would achieve the exit of their country from the European Union. We talk clearly about all of that in an even more recent resolution by the Parliament of December 2023 on the European elections of 2024 which we will vote soon. And I quote, "Whereas all too often the political campaigns for the European elections in the member states are not sufficiently European, but are, and this is between brackets, but are dominated by political debates of a purely national, regional, and local nature." And faced with this problem, the solution lies in the promotion of political parties at European level, which contribute to forming a European political awareness and expressing the will of the citizens of the Union. And of course, the introduction of a union constituency in which 28 MEPs would be elected. We have seen already other solutions, the ones, for example, proposed by the Conference on the Future of Europe, which are more radical and that would demand the reform of treaties. And as we know, this is a very difficult task, so these are not immediate measures. The introduction of a Europe-wide referendum that would be applied in exceptional circumstances, but would definitely come with its difficulties when it comes, for example, to the possible election of the President of the Commission by universal suffrage of the citizens of the Union. And finally, I would also like to point out and say a couple of words about a European right of citizen participation, which consists of the Citizens' Initiative. This right, as defined in the Treaty on European Union, appears to be protected from any distortion resulting from an exercise that is merely oriented towards a national political space, because it's been formulated in very precise legal terms. So, this is the case of the European Citizens' Initiative, which must be necessarily aimed at inviting the European Commission to submit an appropriate proposal on matters which the citizen promotes require a legal act of the Union for the purpose of implementing the treaties. So here the definition really restricts the exercise of this right to the European sphere, because this initiative that is submitted to the Commission needs to be targeted to the realization of a legal act by European institutions. So they cannot have a national objective.
In relation to this initiative, to this European right citizen, to talk about a specific anecdote, something that happened to me as General Director, as you know, the judges from the European Court of Justice are bound by the secrecy principle in our deliberations. However, my anecdote falls outside that secrecy. It happened during a public event, during a public moment. Therefore, I can tell you about it. I am referring to the EFER matter, and it happened in 2016. The question being decided was the following, and I apologize in beforehand for being too legal here in my words. The question was whether we could revoke a matter so as to open the continuity for international negotiations of a matter being discussed, and that by virtue of the international treaty, a new European open trade space would be open between Europe and North America. So, in view of signing that treaty, whether that could constitute a principle for setting up the concept of European citizenship. It was a German citizen that had petitioned the Commission as part of this European initiative, to revoke part of the treaty so as to advance the negotiation of the international treaty. The Commission denied the granting of that, of the stopping of that initiative, and it was considered that it could be the object of the initiative. My anecdote, however, refers to the fact that the lawyer representing the citizens at the time signing the petition, addressed the audience and told the members of the jury, as you can see, this room is empty this morning, and this is very sad because this question of European citizenship is actually very important. So I would like to remind the words from that lawyer, from that legal representative, which was absolutely right at the time in his words. And let me just conclude by saying that this is just a mere pretext to tell you or to refer to a Belgian poet, Wilhelmine, which refers to the exercise of European citizenship, because we always say that exercising European citizenship has much to do with the previous attitude, with the attitude of mind, with the spirit, which is your spirit when you address Europe. As we said before, the attitude must be a European one, not a national one, but Bifalhaden said on the new version of the commandment of God, admire one another, admire yourselves, admire the other, admire one the other. So this new version of this new command, I think, is essential, and this should be the guiding principle of any attitude, of any European attitude towards Europe. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the speaker for his wonderful presentation. He has managed to make a perfect synthesis between legal matters and civic questions. He has addressed the question of European citizenship within the European political space. He has provided us with some solutions, and he has provided us with the mechanisms that citizens do have in relation to the exercise of their rights as European citizens. So 3464944. So that might the telephone number for your questions. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Schlagnitweit. Thank you very much for your invitation to be here in Madrid. This is my second time in Madrid. Apologies for not addressing you in Spanish. Obviously, I am German. And since my language stand is German, I'm going to try to speak this morning in Italian, so I'll do my best. When I refer to the subsidiarity principle, I refer to it from the viewpoint of the social doctrine of the Church, which has a different meaning. Of course, it is different from the European meaning, from European politics. I'm going to start in relation to the allocation of competencies between the Union and member states. The Catholic social doctrine, and together with the subsidiarity principles and the approach to a common good, pan-European and universal common good. This principle of social doctrine is never linked to one another. Rather, they are complement to each other, and sometimes they correct themselves in a reciprocal manner. In a society where centrifugal forces tend to circulate, national or individual interests should be secondary in relation to European or universal interests. And I think this is of fundamental importance these days in the context of the European Union. On the 8th of April, very recently, a group of bishops coming from Eastern Europe, which were part of the group Euregio, published a pastoral letter titled New Air for Europe, Fresh Air for Europe, aimed at the next European elections. In that letter, the bishops recognized the enormous achievements in terms of the European integration when it comes to progress, to technological cooperation and technological progress. But at the same time, bishops consider that the European integration is compromised and that it's facing great challenges. They refer to a crisis of European awareness, consciousness, and they believe that European populism comes from dissatisfaction, and they see nationalist populism the main danger and attack towards European conscience. These populist movements are directed not only towards the creation of a European conscience, but it goes against it. It goes against the electoral campaigns, which are mainly organized at national level. Therefore, on the one hand, we've got pro-European parties that want to promote the European integration, and on the other hand, we've got populist parties, Eurosceptics, and right-wing parties that give priority to national interest over European interest, and they threaten to leave the European Union. And we see, as part of the campaigns, very superficial political debates where the most urgent political issues are ignored. So, for instance, instead of addressing the climate policy or European climate policy or European security policy or social policy, etc., we can see how the narratives as part of the European elections are focused only on questions against Europe. So we can see electoral campaigns where political candidates question the competencies and the powers of the European institutions and of the positions of the politicians. And so we can see that this creates dissatisfaction and a lack of participation on the part of citizens in the European elections. Nevertheless, we cannot consider them as the only responsible for instilling negativity on the European Union. Not only right-wing parties are responsible for that, we also have to find culprits within the institutions, even within the Commission and the Parliament. In this context, it is appropriate to have a look at the main key prerequisites for the good functioning of democracies at functional level. I would like to highlight something which refers to the dialogue based upon the social doctrine of the Church. Democracies do need diversity for their own development, for the development of their own policies, and they also require of an opposition which is effective. They also need of stable governments with stable majorities in relation to the opposition, to a effective position. This is not usually the case at European level, because European structures are mainly characterized by compromise and agreement, which is not bad in itself. However, elections in a democratic sphere allow to show the satisfaction or dissatisfaction with politics so as to either reject or approve political programs, and this is not always possible within the context of the European Union. Although we have different political parties at European level, they are only composed by the delegates chosen at the national member states. Therefore, the electoral campaigns, European electoral campaigns, are mainly concentrated and mainly focused on the dynamics between the national governments and the opposition government, but not on electoral programs which refer to European matters and European issues. And so national interests are center stage, and the debates focus mainly on Europe yes, Europe no, against or in favor of Europe. So I fully agree with the previous speaker when he said that European elections should have a greater role if the European citizens are to participate in a more decisive manner in the European context. They have to be more aware of European programs, and they have to fully align themselves with European interests, not only with national interests. But also, European elections should give citizens the opportunity to decide upon the different European programs. They should also be allowed to express their own satisfaction or dissatisfaction with Europe. This lack of of a clear political stand, is an obstacle to this process, so this can be seen in the light of a democratic deficit. From my viewpoint, it is important that we conduct more comprehensive reforms which supplement the proposals by the previous speaker, Calvo-Sotelo. First of all, because MPs should be only 28 for the new circumscription of the European Union. The European Parliament does not need a legitimacy at European level. From the viewpoint of a federal government, the European Union is fundamented in the Council of the European Union. Second, also because the European Commission, only the European Commission should determine the European electoral lists. Therefore, representing the diversity of European member states, and also by respecting a fundamental principle in this regard, so that we can have a party, a European party, or a coalition party, European coalition party, and the corresponding opposing parties. Third, from a more basic viewpoint, I think European awareness cannot be successful unless there is an internal development of the European Constitution going through or moving from a confederation of states to a federation of states. And here I am referring to Tedesco Aremas, the philosopher, who said there is no just and fair life in the mistake, meaning that we have to go deeper and reach to the roots of the European Constitution if we are to change the awareness of European citizens. We are referring here to the check of balances here between the different institutions and bodies of the European Union. However, I will not go deeper into that because that goes beyond the subject of this conference. But just let me mention that social media do have an important role from the viewpoint of democracy, as long as they focus themselves not only in national politics but also in European politics. But I'm sure our next speaker, Carlo Muzzi, will address all these topics in greater detail. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I liked how you have linked the principle of subsidiarity with the question of European awareness, conscious. This is something that has been referred to several times by Pope Paul VI. I think that your presentation has been very interesting, so we are looking forward to listening to our next speaker, who will go deeper into all these questions. So now I would like to give the floor to Carlo Muzzi. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank Paul VI Foundation for their invitation And for me, it is a pleasure being here this morning because it gives me the opportunity to reflect upon a very urgent question these days. And basing on what Speaker Calvo-Sotelo has just said, I would like to continue talking about the allocation of competencies between the Union and the member states. Also, in relation to what Professor Schlagnitweit has said, in relation to the role of social media, which is very reductionist and refers everything to von der Leyen and Macron. When we all know that the difficulties in Europe go over that, there are many questions which are being discussed, one of them being the European citizenship building via the action of political parties. And also, I will talk about the Spitzenkandidat as a tool, as an effective tool. According to a recent survey, over 70% of Europeans will vote in the next European elections, and this is a step forward if we consider that the abstention rate was higher some years ago, amounting to only 60%. And also considering that we have seen 27 different political campaigns and that the narrative, the discourse is very much fragmented. Political campaigns which are focused on national questions and interests instead of in national interests. So European questions are considered secondary because the national states, they do not manage to convey the full picture of Europe, and citizens do not really understand very well what is at stake at European level, and also because national politicians are more interested in conveying national interests. So we can see a national logic here instead of a European vision, a European viewpoint. Just as Professor Sotelo said, the citizens are mainly focused on the national sphere, and not so much in the international sphere. So, if we have a look at the initiatives from the European parties, let us try and see if there is any program or political manifesto at European level that do not have a strong voice in Europe. So we can see that all manifestos and programs are very weak, and they subscribe just a mere and a very lax charter of values for European citizens. And most European citizens really do not know about the number and the range of political parties they can choose from in Europe. We have seen very recently that European that some of the objectives set by European parties are lost throughout the way because the message is not conveyed to citizens, and citizens do have a distorted image of the range of political parties in Europe. So political parties in Europe are facing enormous difficulties in conveying an adequate image of their programs and manifestos. And just as the head of government from Hungary said very recently, part of the Hungary, following the membership to the European Union in 2004, and following a coalition with the European Popular Party, in a coalition headed by Orban, has put in place policies and initiatives which are contrary to the rule of law, therefore damaging and contradicting not only basic fundamental rights but also the principles of the Charter of a Fundamental Charter of Human Rights. So we can see a failure there, and we have seen how this political party has been ousted. So we can ask ourselves, how is it possible to increase European awareness, European consciousness, if we see such an enormous range of political parties and so many objections and so many contradictions between values, between political values? Also, it is essential to reach an equilibrium, to reach a balance, and this is not always the case. We've seen a recent case of a socialist party in a Scandinavian country where, following some initiatives within the party, the balance was broken. Also, Julian Parker, who is the new president of the Slovak government, and also part of the nationalist party, takes part in the European debate as part of an agreement between political parties at European level. So we can see that at pan-European level there is a dual challenge. On the one hand, an interpretation of national politics, and on the other hand, an interpretation of the European line of policies. Also take into consideration the fatigue and the tiredness of social media. Therefore, at European level, we can see a wide consensus, and this is something objective, something that we can see objectively in relation to citizens. It has been especially difficult, the question of some political or some social media. Some journalists have referred to difficulties at European level.
So if we can convey those differences, if parties manage to convey those differences to the citizens, I believe that participation could be much more substantial. For instance, We can talk about populist or skeptical forces as reduced, but very impactful, and they can have an impact actually on these policies. And these groups have increased. And paradoxically, since today we're talking about participation, I believe that they have a bigger influence when it comes to elections, particularly the European elections, if compared to the parties of the more traditional families. But of course, it's an illusionary participation that is limited to this electoral moment, because then these parties are characterized by leading character, so they don't have really a real relationship with electors. So the effort must be to convey the complexity, being aware of the fact that democracy has a cost, and then pro-European forces need to be aware of this reality if they don't want to lose contact with citizens, and particularly if they don't want to give in to those who want to destroy the Union. And this leads me to the analysis of the second aspect that I would like to mention. I believe that these instruments that European parties have in order to improve citizen participation are, first of all, Spitzencandidate, that it's a model according to which, since 2014, parties can indicate their candidate for the European Commission. That would be the leading candidate during the electoral campaign, and therefore citizens should vote for their parties, and they would vote in this way also for a president of the Commission. Of course, the procedure is a lot more complex, because the day after, then the candidate would be validated by the Council that would suggest the name to the Parliament. But this process only worked in 2014, when the candidacy of Juncker prevailed. Already in 2019, Ursula von der Leyen emerged as a federal figure, and only at the seat of the Council. The true candidate of the Popular Party was Manfred Weber, but he didn't have consensus within the European Council. Therefore, the system of Spitzencandidate, as it is conceived, it's not credible, it cannot work. And it was only used by few parties like PP, by socialists, by the European left, and we have actually an Austrian candidate for them. I believe that Democrats have proposed 3 figures. In 2017, they proposed 9. The sovereignists of the they haven't actually proposed any candidate, because they don't really believe in this European participation system, or maybe they don't they don't believe in this system. So we believe this system to be a complete default or a complete failure. We need to favor citizen participation, and we need also to alleviate the fears of the different member states. Therefore, the Union is in the midst of its path to affirmation, and the Conference on the Future of Europe has been a first attempt in order to increase participation. But I agree with the person who spoke before me. The only way to increase participation in Europe is through the revision of treaties to reinforce integration, knowing that this perspective needs to make accounts with those who would like to go back to the European community as a simple organization that gathers states and that safeguards sovereignty. So it's a community that is not well understood as a container of states and not as a destination. Of course, we should all strive for a united Europe that was born from the ashes of Second World War, and that nowadays is the only lighthouse of human rights, civil rights in this global scenario of desperation and suffering. Thank you very much. Thank you for this lucid and truthful interpretation of this historical moment, of this fragmented debate we're having, of this need to know how to convey the complexity and the costs of democracy, and the review of treaties, the revision of treaties as a challenge that we have in front of us. I have to admit that we're running a little bit late, but we have a question here that I'm going to read and that I'm going to address to our rapporteur. And the person who sent the question said, I have impression that when a country presents a conflict before or at the EU, this one inhibits us, and the party willingness prevails over neutrality. I believe that an amnesty law without a corrective objective is unfair, and the European community is not giving a clear response. We need amnesty, but not to do the same things as in the past. There is not a purpose of amendment. So it's a very local take on this question. Thank you very much. Well, I believe that the question is certainly interesting, but I think it illustrates the problem that we referred to from the very beginning of this session. That is how national problems that are presented and at the European seat are using European institutions to deal with problems that are actually national problems. The European Union has its limitations. It can take part in order to resolve national problems. I'd like to remind you all of that very famous quote by Ortega there. It's famous for us Spaniards, but maybe not for our guests. This morning, Ortega used to say, Spain is the problem, Europe is the solution. He said that in 1910. Of course, Spain is not the problem any longer, but Spain still has problems. And for some of these problems, it can go to Europe that can be of help. And that can be the case, for example, of the renewal of the General Council of the Judiciary, because Europe has a judiciary process that is very developed in terms of independence of powers. Well, having said that, when it comes to the issue of amnesty, that I think it goes further or go beyond the limitations of the European Union. And everything that can be done is what the Venice Commission has done. Would you like to give an answer, maybe? You have 2 minutes to go. Well, I would like to make 2 short references to the intervention of Dr. Schlagnitweit and Carlo Muzzi. And I'd briefly like to point out to the federal state that mentioned Dr. Schlagnitweit. Well, today we are remembering Altiero Spinelli, since we're all speaking Italian, or that's the main language that is spoken right now. And I sympathize with that position, but I believe that we need to be cautious, as the European Union has always been. Let's remember that in 1951, the foundational treaty of the European Community for Coal and Steel talked about the federal character of it. In 1957, in the Treaty of Rome, the term supranational disappeared out of caution, since they were taking a leap to a community that would cover all of the economic activity by member states. And this leap was compensated with a step backwards, which was not to mention the issue of supranationality as it was mentioned before. I remember hearing Íñigo Mendoza de Vigo, who's going to be with us this afternoon, when he was an MEP, saying when he met a British politician And he mentioned how this person entered his office and said, "Are you a federalist?" without even saying hello. And this was such an important word, right? But of course, we won't create Europe out of a single stroke. We have to go little by little, but we need to have a very clear objective in mind that is not debatable. The Catholic Church in the 15th century said those kings who are sovereign and don't recognize the sovereign power of God are suffering from a capital sin. And last but not least, I would like to congratulate Carlo Muzzi for the lucid criticism of the Spitzenkandidatin. I believe it was a very well-documented critic that underlines the importance of the European Council. It is true that the European Council ends up making decisions, and we're still in a phase that we could refer to as in terms of aristocratic or oligarchical of certain European processes. But the democratic phase will come in the future, and the young people who are taking part in the Erasmus programs will probably have the opportunity to experience that coming phase. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've had a great rapporteur, great speakers, and I'd like to thank once again this wonderful organization. And we have a break previewed, so I think that we can meet again at 12:15. Thank you very much.
Tenemos el café, está abajo, en la zona de abajo, ¿eh? Gracias.